Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of You've Gotta See This, your guide to what's playing in theaters and at home now. I'm your host Brad, joined by my co-host Blake. Blake, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good to hear. We've got a handful of movies that we want to talk to you guys about. First off, we're going to start with what's playing in theaters and start with Jumanji: The Next Level. In Jumanji: The Next Level, the gang from the first movie returns to Jumanji to save Spencer after he journeys into the game by himself, and that's where we start off. Basically, what happens in this movie is the same setup as the first one. They're sucked into a video game, but this time everyone's roles get switched. The Rock is now Danny DeVito, and Kevin Hart is now Danny Glover, which makes for some really great comedy. The Rock is really hilarious doing his Danny DeVito impression, and Kevin Hart is hysterical as Danny Glover. All of the body swapping in this movie is really great, leads to a lot of really funny scenes. For me, the entire movie is stolen by Awkwafina and Danny DeVito. They both completely steal the show. Awkwafina is having a great year between this and The Farewell, and she just got her own show on Comedy Central. She is one of my favorite entertainers out there, and she is on her A game in this movie. Karen Gillan plays a much bigger role in this movie than the first one, does an amazing job with it. All of the action is an absolute blast and evenly spaced, so it doesn't take over the film or detract from the story at all. Unfortunately, there are a handful of jokes that fell flat for me, and the movie doesn't quite have the same magic that made the first one so much fun. It is a little bit overlong, in my opinion, and kind of goes on for a little bit too long. Some of the repeated jokes really start to get stale and feel overused. It's kind of a mixed bag for me. There is a lot more good than there is bad. The last 20 minutes of this movie is an absolute blast, but overall I think I gotta give Jumanji: The Next Level a 3.5 out of 5.
So for me, this was one of my most anticipated movies of 2019. I went into this movie with sky high expectations after the first Jumanji, which I thought is one of the best family comedies in years. I loved that movie. I was very excited for this movie. I was a little bit let down by this movie overall. Overall, I think that it's a solid action comedy that has many great ideas, and I think half of them are executed well. Like you were saying, there's some weird pacing stuff going on in this movie. I think the first 20 minutes are really good. It kind of lags in the middle. There's a lot of repeated jokes and stale jokes. I think that The Rock doing the DeVito impersonation is funny for about 10 minutes, and then I wasn't really there for it. I think that Kevin Hart, surprisingly, I don't like Kevin Hart. I don't think he's that funny, but he was one of my favorite parts of this movie. I thought him doing the Danny Glover impersonation was actually very, very funny, and I thought they did more with his character and with his humor than they did with The Rock, because The Rock, it was kind of just he can kind of sound like DeVito. Isn't that funny? And it just kind of fell flat after a while. Awkwafina saves this movie. She is incredible. She's great in everything that she's in. The last 20 minutes are very Awkwafina heavy, and I think that's why I came out of this movie actually really enjoying it, because I was getting worried about 3/4 of the way through. I was like, am I going to have to give this a bad review? Like, what's going on here? It's just kind of like middle of the road. Last 20 minutes are really, really strong. Awkwafina carries that movie through to the end. The special effects in this movie are very, very good. They are some of the best I've seen in a comedy. Usually big studio comedies don't get a big special effects budget, but this one got it, and I think the effects really pay off. I think that it makes for really, really great action, really exciting action. I think the action is one-upped from the previous one. I think the humor is one down from the last one, and that's why I need to give this movie a 3 out of 5.
Yeah, 3 out of 5 sounds like a fair score to me. So next, we're going to talk about another film that started playing this week, Clint Eastwood's Richard Jewell. Richard Jewell is the true story of a man named Richard Jewell, surprisingly, a failed cop turned security guard who finds a bomb at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics and all of the events that follow. Now, first off, I want to say there are some incredible performances in this movie, especially from Kathy Bates and Paul Walter Hauser in the title role. Paul Walter Hauser knocks this movie out of the park for me. He is Richard Jewell. There's a moment in the movie where we actually see some actual archive footage of Richard Jewell, and he sounds exactly like Paul Walter Hauser. The rest of the cast is kind of given cookie-cutter characters that we've seen a million times before, unfortunately. Sam Rockwell is one of my absolute favorite actors working. He's one of my favorite actors of all time, but he's given this basic lawyer character that has no real story arc and somehow ends up being boring. It was a huge letdown for me. In fact, the whole movie was kind of a letdown and kind of boring. It never quite fully takes off. Nothing really stands out except for the poor editing and continuity errors, which I'm sure are attributed to the fact that Eastwood only does a handful of takes in his movies. It is extremely overlong, and it drags in more than one area. Despite some great performances, overall it feels like a chore to get through. It's not interesting enough of a story to warrant a 2-hour and 15-minute runtime. And what they do with that time, it very easily could have been shortened into an hour and 40-minute movie and be much more tight and be just a better experience overall. I think despite some great performances, I got to give Richard Jewell a 2 out of 5.
So this was another movie that I was very excited for. I love Clint Eastwood. The trailers for this movie are fantastic. You see that cast and it's like, wow, there's no way this movie can be bad. I was so unbelievably underwhelmed by this movie. At the very beginning, from 5 minutes in, there is a glaring continuity error that is right in front of the screen, right in front of you at the introduction of one of your main characters, and you can't not see it, no matter how much you're trying to not see it. Then this movie keeps going, and the continuity errors and the editing keeps showing, and it's bad. It's very, very blatant, very easy stuff that can be fixed very easily, and that's why this whole movie to me feels lazy. It feels like one of Clint Eastwood's laziest movies. It also at times feels like Clint Eastwood as just an old man shaking his fist at the fake news media. It can also come across as just Clint Eastwood being an angry old man shaking his fist at the fake news media. I don't think that's a very strong stance or anything to take necessarily. I think there's pretty good acting in this movie. I think the lead character, the guy that plays Richard Jewell, what was his name again?
Paul Walter Hauser.
He is great. I've seen him in a few things pop up here and there, and he's fantastic. I think that he's great in this movie. This movie's about 30 minutes too long. It's not interesting enough to warrant how long it is at all, like you were saying. The biggest flaw with this movie for me is I didn't care about what was happening or who got caught or who got in trouble for this or whatever, because your protagonist is so unlikable. It almost makes sense why they thought that he was someone who could have done it. You almost side with them, or you can see it from their perspective, but the movie feels like you're supposed to be standing with this guy against the system and against the media, but you can't stand with him because he's so unlikable and is always abusing his power. And I really just didn't enjoy hardly any of this movie, but because there was good acting in it, aside from Olivia Wilde, who was terrible, aside from her, everyone else is pretty good, so I'll give it a 1.5 out of 5.
All right. So moving to what we've got playing at home, this week we have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, available at your local Redbox or wherever you rent movies. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is the latest epic from Quentin Tarantino. It follows an actor and his stunt double in the summer of 1969 in Los Angeles. For me, this movie absolutely hits the mark in every way, but I want to diverge to Blake. Let me hear what you have to say about this movie.
So I think this is absolutely one of Tarantino's strongest movies. This is a rare movie that gets better the more you think about it. The farther you are away from seeing it, the better it becomes. This movie is a beautiful love letter to Sharon Tate and the day of classic cinema stars, classic movie stars. Almost every single thing that happens in the movie happens for a specific reason, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment, because there are moments in this movie, the first time you watch it, that feel like, okay, what are we doing here? Because there's not really a specific plot to it. It's just kind of you're watching these two characters hang out, and it's almost a slice of life movie until the last 30 minutes, which are hysterical. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's out of this world, and it's just Tarantino glory. This movie is actually, in my opinion, the best comedy of 2019. I think it is hysterical. I think you fully can call this movie a comedy because the jokes are constant. The rhythm to it feels like a comedy most of the time. and I think that the actors play it like a comedy, and they play it perfectly. I think this is one of Brad Pitt's strongest roles he's ever done. I think these two characters of Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth are two of the strongest characters Tarantino's ever made, which is insane praise because it's Tarantino. All he does is make iconic characters. I will say that I didn't love this movie the first time that I saw it. It's gotten better each time that I've seen it. It's gotten a little bit better. And I think that that's a testament to a great movie, is that if it makes you watch it again, it makes you think about things in a different light, then that's the true markings of a great filmmaker. And I think that Tarantino is at the top of his game here. And I have to go 4.5 out of 5 for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Awesome. For me, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is just Tarantino at the top of his game. The soundtrack is killer as always. The editing is precise. Cinematography is perfection, and the cast is absolutely out of this world. You got Brad Pitt, Leonardo DiCaprio, Margot Robbie, Emile Hirsch, Kurt Russell, Margaret Qualley, Bruce Dern. The list goes on and on and on and on. So many great cameos in this movie. So many great performances of people playing actors from classic 60s era Hollywood. The film is shot wonderfully, and it has all of the Tarantino signature angles that we've come to know and love. I think that this is Tarantino's most mature work as a filmmaker to date. You can see him using everything he's learned from his previous work, and all of that really comes through on screen. Like you were saying, I think it is his funniest film, in my opinion. There's always at least one humorous scene in all of Tarantino's movies, but this one will have you laughing out loud multiple times throughout the entire film. I completely agree with what you're saying. The movie gets better and better every time I see it. I loved it the first time I saw it, but it wasn't my favorite Tarantino movie. But the more I think about it, the more it moves up that list. It just keeps getting better and better. Just like in Inglourious Basterds, it's evident that Tarantino likes to play around with history in his films, and the alternate history of Los Angeles in 1969 that he comes up with is absolutely riveting and hilarious. And I can't say enough good about this movie. Every time I rewatch it or spend time thinking about it, it moves up on my list for the year. And I gotta give Once Upon a Time in Hollywood a 5 out of 5 for that reason.
Oh, there you go. 5 out of 5.
So next, we're going to talk about a very different movie playing on Netflix right now. That is Michael Bay's new movie, Six Underground. In Six Underground, Ryan Reynolds heads up a team of off-the-grid mercenaries to take down a dictator. Blake, tell us what you thought about Six Underground.
Is that what that movie was about? I had no idea that's what that movie was about, but that's really good to know. I watched this entire movie. You and I watched it together. This movie has everything that you've come to expect from a Michael Bay movie. It checks all the boxes. If you played Michael Bay bingo, the entire board would be filled up in the first 10 minutes of the movie. It's nonsense. The timeline makes no sense. There's no time travel in this movie, but the timeline makes absolutely no sense. You don't know when things are happening. It'll say 4 years ago and then 6 months later, so you don't know if that's 6 months later from the present or from the 4 years ago, so now we're 3.5 years back in time. The movie actually makes your brain hurt because of how bad it is. There are very, very weird parkour dubstep action scenes that feel right out of a 2011 YouTube video that your uncle would post on Facebook. There are more musical cues and musical changes in this movie than in the fucking Suicide Squad. There is a Muse song that plays 3 times in the first half hour of the movie. 3 different times the same song plays. I don't know what Michael Bay is. I don't understand his brain. I don't understand people that like his movies. None of it will ever make any sense to me. His movies make me mad. I think they dumb people down. I feel like I'm a dumber and worse person for having witnessed this movie. It's getting a 0 out of 5. Fuck this movie.
0 out of 5. You see, we have our first zero on the podcast. All right. So for me, the way that the characters are introduced in this movie is super weird. It does this weird, like, kind of calling card thing for them. And it just kind of happens randomly because there are scenes where we heard a character talk before, but we didn't get a calling card for them. And then all of a sudden they'll deliver a line and then bam, here's number 4. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Dave Franco's in this movie for all of like 5 minutes and he's completely wasted. All of the action in this movie is cranked up to 11 in the worst way, and it's some of the most ridiculous stuff I've ever seen in an action movie. A guy gets shot in the face with a grenade launcher and it breaks his nose in slow motion. That's an actual shot in this movie. There is so much product placement in this movie, and it is extremely noticeable. It seems like every turn there's a new alcohol or drink or candy or phone or car that they're trying to shove down your throat.
Ryan Reynolds got to promote that aviation gin, baby.
Of course, it's
Get that
there.
Money.
It's right there in the movie. There is a shot that is nothing but an aviation gin bottle. It has a completely confusing timeline and tone. They're cracking jokes 1 second and wanting you to laugh, and then they're dealing with Alzheimer's and genocide in the next scenes. It just doesn't make any sense, takes itself way too seriously. It has the most hyperactive editing I've ever seen in a movie. It's like less than 2 seconds for like every shot in this movie. It's crazy. The pacing is awful, and the movie is 2 fucking hours long. It feels like an eternity. Like you were saying, it feels like Suicide Squad. It feels like a glorified music video because there are so many music cues. There's a Muse song that plays 3 different times and then another song that plays 2 different times in this movie. It makes absolutely no sense. We had to take a break while watching this movie because it was dumbing us down so much. I have to give Six Underground a 1 out of 5.
Oh, you're giving it a star.
I'm giving it a 1 because it did make me laugh at how ridiculous it was.
Okay, that's fair. I couldn't bring myself to even acknowledge that this movie has any merit or value.
So with that, we thank you so much for joining us for another episode. We'll be back next week with more thoughts on what to watch. And until then, be sure to subscribe, give us a review, and we will see you all next time.